Put away the white guilt, everybody. It turns out this country isn't the country it is with the prosperity we've enjoyed, well, until recent years anyway. Don't feel like very prosperous these days as a result of slavery. No, we've been told that we're terrible, awful people, and it's all to do with having an empire and colonising all of these countries around the world, and slavery, of course, that has made Britain rich. Well, according to a brand new book, a new study by the Institute of Economic Affairs, actually, no, it wasn't that made us rich. It made only a marginal contribution to the prosperity we have enjoyed. Well, let's talk to the author of that report, Dr. Kristian Niemietz from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Good afternoon to you, Kristian. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. So we've always been told, you know, look, it's because of the horrific crime of transatlantic slavery and our colonial attitudes, things. That is why we've got rich. But your research says, no, that's not why.
That's right, yes. The profits from the transatlantic slave trade and from various other endeavors in different parts of the empire were big enough to make some families, some individual families, fabulously rich. And that is undeniable. Nobody argues with that. But they were nowhere near big enough to make a big contribution to the industrialization process that happened domestically. That was mostly driven by domestic factors. And if at all, you could say that some of the profits earned in parts of the empire made a small contribution to it, but probably not even that, because, of course, all of that had to be heavily subsidized. So imperialism, we can think of it as a heavily subsidized business which relied on state support.
Yeah, indeed. And that's the thing, it was free trade. It was being able to trade on the oceans. That was what actually, did for us in terms of boosting our economy. And then the hard work of British people, entrepreneurs, but also those who did the hard slog in the factories in the industrial age that actually delivered for us. Look, there's no doubt at all, as you say, there are some families and big aristocratic families. We're told, oh, the royal family this, another family here, they did well. But people don't seem to forget, you know, the idea that the average white person, the average Brit living in this country in those centuries, the idea that they were living the life of Riley off the backs of the appalling treatment of African slaves taken to America, it's an absolute nonsense. Their lives were hell as well.
Yes, so if some individual families, or let's say if the National Trust administers a building that was partly financed with slave money, if they want to acknowledge that, I don't see anything wrong with that. I'd say that is just the history of the building. That isn't wokery, but that is very different from saying the country as a whole benefited, that Britain as a whole is richer today than it would have been without the empire. There's no evidence for that. It may have made a small contribution at the time, but even then it would have worn off. That effect would have worn off over time.
Well, indeed. And also, of course, there was a huge cost to us ending the transatlantic slave trade. Not only would you say this is actually wrong and immoral, we ended it, and we actually spent a fortune policing the seas. First empire to end slavery. Every empire has had slavery, but to be actually policing the seas and also paying off, and I know it feels horrific now, but it was the only way to do it, basically paying off the slave owners by effectively compensating them for, they regarded human beings as basically like cattle, compensating them for their slaves. Now, it feels appalling now, but we were still paying that off within the last few years.
Well, okay, yes, there was a loan that was taken out at the time, and it was, of course, as is usually the case with government bonds, it was paid off over a long period. But I don't quite buy the idea that we were paying off specifically for the slavery compensation, because at the end of the day, governments just take on a lot of debt, and you can't really say this pound is for slavery compensation, this pound is for something else. And in the end, it all goes into a big pot.
But basically, nothing to feel guilty for, folks. Relax. End of white guilt and British colonial guilt, yes?
Well, you can say that imperialism and the slave trade had a negative impact on the areas affected. That's a slightly different debate. So some of those places are perhaps even today are poorer now than they otherwise would have been because it upset their development.
Some, though, might be better off. Again, I've been to a lot of countries around the world. Being colonised by Britain wasn't perhaps the worst option for some of these countries. Really appreciate you joining us from the IEA. That's Dr. Kristian Niemietz. Quick word from Benedict.
History is complex and it involves a lot of nuance, and I think often people forget it by reducing things down to things like imperialism bad, slavery bad.
Yeah.
It's far too simplified. Actually, I think that this is very important that we have these conversations.
Yeah, also, there were goodies and baddies. Well, no, they were just, those are the morals at the time. Indeed. Thank you very much, Benedict. Really appreciate you joining me on the show today.